The wind came down off the ridge like something alive, long and low and relentless, dragging curtains of snow across the frozen fields until the world beyond a few yards dissolved into white motion. Fences vanished first, then the narrow ruts of the wagon road, then even the dark line of the timber at the creek. By dusk there was no horizon left, only a sky the color of old iron pressed hard against the earth. It was the kind of cold that did not merely settle over a place, but seized it, tightened its grip hour by hour, and dared anything with breath in its lungs to challenge it. Inside the scattered cabins along the hollow, fires roared in wide stone hearths built of river rock and mud mortar. Sparks snapped and climbed the chimneys. Iron stove doors glowed dull red in the deepest hours of the evening. Every family worked the same routine, a rhythm learned from fathers and grandfathers and carried across oceans and mountain passes: split the wood small, stack it dry, feed the fire often. Heat, they believed, came from effort. If the cabin cooled, it meant someone had grown careless. The sound of axes had rung through the hollow since early autumn. Even in October, when frost first silvered the pumpkins in the fields, men had stood at chopping blocks from dawn to dark, swinging steel into oak and hickory. The blows echoed off the hillsides like distant gunshots. Boys too small to handle full-sized mauls dragged branches into piles. Women stacked split rails beneath lean taws to keep them dry. Wood meant survival. Wood meant one more night without frozen water buckets and cracked fingers. By November, neat rows of split logs stood higher than cabin roofs, and still no one felt they had enough, because winter did not respect confidence. On nights like this, the routine turned punishing. The fire that seemed strong at supper dwindled by midnight to a bed of coals that could barely warm a hand. Split logs burned hot and fast, their fresh-cut faces eager to catch flame, their edges licking bright and fierce for a short while before collapsing into ash. More surface area, the men would say with pride, though they did not use the phrase in that way. More edges for the fire to bite. They liked the look of it, the quick blaze, the satisfying crack as wood gave way to heat. But speed had a cost. In cabin after cabin that night, doors creaked open as men rose from rough bunks. Blankets were thrown back reluctantly. Boots, stiff from drying near the hearth, were tugged on with numb hands. The cold waited patiently in the dark corners of every room, and once the fire slackened, it advanced inch by inch. Water in tin cups skinned over with ice. Breath fogged thick and hung in the air like smoke. The walls themselves seemed to shrink, their chinking cracking faintly under the strain. A man would kneel by the hearth, rake the coals together with an iron poker, and lay 2 or 3 split logs across them. He would crouch close, palms extended, watching for flame to catch. Sometimes it flared quickly. Sometimes it sulked, stubborn and smoky, and he would curse under his breath and add kindling. When the fire finally took, he would linger a moment longer, letting the heat sting his face before crawling back to bed. An hour later, or 2 at most, the ritual would begin again. No one slept through a night like this, not truly. Sleep came in thin layers, easily broken. The mind never drifted far from the fire. It was like tending a restless animal, one that demanded feeding at regular intervals. If ignored too long, it would die, and the cabin would fall to the cold as surely as if its roof had blown away. Across the hollow, in a cabin set slightly apart near the stand of birch trees, a different kind of preparation had taken place that afternoon. While other men had been splitting the last of their autumn stacks into smaller pieces, refining them down to kindling-sized slats for quicker ignition, he had done something that drew stares. He had dragged an entire tree trunk from the edge of the timber to his door. Not a neatly cut round, not a sectioned log ready for the axe. A whole trunk, trimmed of branches but otherwise intact, thick as a man, thigh, and nearly as long as the cabin itself. It left a furrow in the snow as it came, the bark scraping and shedding in dark curls. He had looped a chain around one end and leaned his weight into it, boots digging for purchase on the packed ground. The effort was undeniable, but it was a single labor, concentrated and deliberate, rather than the repeated rhythm of splitting and stacking. Men paused mid-swing to watch him. What is he planning to do with that? Someone had muttered, leaning on his axe handle. Maybe he thinks the fire L split it for him. Another replied with a short laugh. The laughter carried easily in the brittle air. They knew his habit of doing things a little differently. He measured boards twice when others measured once. He patched roofs before storms instead of after. He stored water in deeper barrels and kept a tighter lid on his flour bins. It was not that he was careless. If anything, it was the opposite. But difference has a way of appearing like idleness when judged by those who mistake repetition for diligence. He hauled the trunk to his doorway and paused only long enough to catch his breath. Then, instead of reaching for his axe, he pulled open the heavy plank door and began maneuvering the trunk inside. That was when the real laughter began, too lazy to split it. One neighbor called out, cupping his hands around his mouth, "Going to smoke himself out." Another added, "Whole tree in the hearth. Might as well light the forest." He did not answer. He kept working, inch by inch, pivoting the trunk so one end pointed toward the stone fireplace. His cabin was modest, but solidly built, the hearth deep and wide enough to swallow sizable logs. He had laid its foundation carefully when he first raised the place, choosing stones that locked together tightly. The chimney rose straight and true, its interior smooth enough to draft well even on still days. By late afternoon, the trunk lay with one end resting just inside the mouth of the hearth, the rest extending back along the cabin floor on a pair of flat stones he had set to lift it slightly off the planks. He made small adjustments, nudging it left and right, checking the angle. It was not a careless placement. It was deliberate, almost measured. From the doorway, a neighbor shook his head. "You'll be up all night fighting that thing," he predicted. "Won't even catch proper." He shrugged once, wiped his hands on his trousers, and closed the door against the wind. Inside, the cabin held a steady chill. The fire in the hearth had burned low during the maneuvering, reduced to a compact bed of coals. He knelt and studied them for a long moment. Then he added a small armful of split kindling, not much, just enough to coax flame back into the room. He did not attempt to ignite the whole trunk at once. Instead, he focused on the cut end resting within the hearth, arranging the smaller pieces around it like a collar. Flame licked upward slowly, cautiously, testing the bark. The trunk did not flare the way split wood did. It darkened first, then began to char. A faint line of smoke rose, drawn steadily up the chimney. He adjusted the draft with a subtle movement of the iron damper, narrowing the opening slightly. Outside, night fell hard and fast. The wind sharpened. Snow crept against cabin walls, piling in corners, pressing against doors. In one cabin down the hollow, a mother wrapped an extra quilt around her youngest child. In another, a man returned from the woodpile with an armful of split oak, shaking snow from his shoulders as he stomped back inside. In his cabin, the flame did not roar. It did not leap wildly against the stones. It settled. The cut end of the trunk began to glow a dull orange beneath its blackened surface. The kindling burned away first, collapsing into embers that nestled against the massive wood. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the fire found purchase in the dense fibers beneath the bark. It was not dramatic. It was steady. He sat back on his heels and watched. The difference between a blaze and a burn is patience. A blaze demands attention. It dazzles and consumes quickly. A burn, properly managed, becomes a companion rather than a tyrant. He had noticed over previous winters that the more he split his wood, the more frequently he had to rise in the night. The sharper the edges, the faster the flame. Heat surged, then vanished. Surged, then vanished. It was like trying to warm a room with handfuls of straw. Tonight he intended something else. Hours passed. The wind battered the cabin walls, but the draft in the chimney held firm. The trunk continued to char at its end, a widening circle of ember red spreading slowly inward. The bark crackled occasionally, but there were no explosive pops, no showers of sparks racing up the flue. The heat radiating from the hearth was not intense in short bursts. It was deep and consistent. In cabins nearby, the first round of midnight tending had begun. Doors opened briefly to admit cold air as men fetched more wood. The chopping block, left outside, now wore a cap of snow. Axes rested against walls, their blades dulled by weeks of labor. Inside, the split logs flared bright and then sagged into ash as they always did. In his cabin he added nothing. He did not sit in the dark. The glow from the hearth cast enough light to see by. Shadows moved gently across the walls as the fire worked its way into the heartwood. He adjusted the damper once more, narrowing it just enough to keep the flame from racing too quickly. The idea was not to suffocate it, but to guide it. Air is the partner of fire, but too much partnership leads to recklessness. Near midnight, he lay down on his bunk fully clothed, as most men did in winter, and pulled a blanket over himself. The heat in the cabin was steady, not stifling, not fading. It hovered in that narrow band between discomfort and chill. He listened for the usual signals, the sharp crack of a collapsing log, the hollow hush that meant flame had died too far back. Instead, he heard a low, continuous murmur like distant wind in trees. He closed his eyes. In the cabin closest to the creek, a man cursed softly as his fire guttered sooner than expected. The split wood he had stacked last week had dried more than he realized. It burned fiercely and left him with little but coals by 1 in the morning. He rose again, teeth clenched, and laid fresh pieces across the embers. His wife stirred but did not fully wake. They had long ago grown used to this dance. Further up the hollow, another family faced a different trouble. Their chimney, built with a slight bend near the top, struggled in heavy wind. Each time a strong gust came down the ridge, smoke puffed back into the room. The man tending that hearth had to adjust his draft repeatedly, sometimes opening it wide, sometimes closing it down, chasing the right balance. The wind did not care for routines. Back in the cabin by the birches, the trunk had burned inward by only a few inches. The exposed end glowed brighter now, a ring of steady heat with a darker core at its center. The outer bark farther down the length remained untouched, cool enough to lay a hand on if one dared. The mass of the wood held its energy tightly, releasing it in measured fashion rather than surrendering it all at once. Outside, the temperature dropped even further. Frost crept thick along window edges. The stars, when briefly visible between racing clouds, glittered with that brittle sharpness that only the deepest cold can carve into the sky. He did not rise at 1, nor at 2. The fire did not demand it. In the third hour of the night, when most cabins along the hollow glowed anew with freshly fed flames, his hearth looked much the same as it had earlier. Not a towering blaze, not a dying bit of ash, but a solid, unwavering core of heat. The trunk had shifted slightly as the burned end shortened, but the flat stones beneath it kept it aligned. Gravity did its quiet work, allowing the log to inch forward into the hearth as its charred portion weakened. There is a difference between labor done in repetition and labor done in thought. The others did not lack strength. They had proven it all autumn with their axes. But strength applied the same way year after year can become habit rather than improvement. He had grown tired of waking every 90 minutes to feed a fire that devoured its meal too quickly. He had grown tired of measuring winter in armfuls of split wood. He had begun to wonder whether the problem was not the cold but the method. Toward dawn, the wind shifted slightly, angling more from the north than the west. Snow that had piled against cabin walls now slid in thin sheets from roof edges. In several homes, fires once again needed tending. The rhythm was nearly predictable. Flare, fade, flare, fade. A man could set his sense of time by it. In his cabin, the glow remained constant. When he finally stirred, it was not from chill but from habit. He opened his eyes to a room still warmed by a low, powerful heat. The air did not sting his lungs. The water in his tin cup had not frozen. The small window above the table showed the faintest hint of gray at its edge, a promise of morning. He sat up slowly and looked toward the hearth. The trunk had burned inward perhaps the length of his hand. The circle of ember red was wider now, and the interior wood glowed with a depth that suggested strength rather than fragility. There was ash beneath it, yes, but not the thick, choking blanket that often accumulated after a night of rapid burning splits. The coals were consolidated, focused. He swung his legs off the bunk and stood, stretching stiffness from his shoulders. Then he stepped closer to the hearth and studied the burn. Satisfied, he did not reach for more wood. Instead, he nudged the trunk forward slightly with his boot, guiding the unburned length a fraction deeper into the hearth. It responded immediately, the exposed edge catching a little more flame. Outside, cabin doors began to open one by one. Men stepped out into the blue-gray dawn, breath rising in heavy clouds. Some went first to their wood piles, counting what remained after the long night. Others simply stood for a moment, shoulders hunched against the cold, gathering resolve for another day of splitting. From the cabin by the birches, no axe rang out. One neighbor noticed first. He paused mid-swing listening. The hollow, so accustomed to the morning chorus of chopping, felt oddly quiet in that direction. He glanced toward the birch stand and saw no movement. A curl of smoke rose from the chimney, thin but steady. He frowned. Another man, hauling a fresh armload of split logs toward his door, followed his gaze. "He up yet?" he asked. "Don't hear him," came the reply. They watched for a moment longer, then shrugged and returned to their routines. There was always wood to split, always another stack to prepare. Inside the quiet cabin, the whole tree continued its slow surrender to flame, not in frantic bursts, but in measured release. The experiment of the night had not ended in smoke or disaster. It had not required constant tending. It had not demanded the weary ritual of waking every hour to feed a hungry fire. It had simply burned, and as the pale light of morning grew stronger, filtering through frost-laced glass and falling across the length of the trunk that still lay intact along the floor, it became clear that the night had tested more than the strength of cabin walls. It had tested the belief that effort alone defined wisdom. Outside, axes rose and fell in familiar rhythm. Inside, a single, unbroken tree fed the hearth with quiet persistence, holding its warmth long after others had begun their day, as labor again. By mid-morning the story had already begun to harden into opinion. Men who had woken 3 times in the night and stepped into boots stiff with cold were not inclined to admire anything that had let another man sleep. They did not say that plainly. Instead, they wrapped their discomfort in practical concerns. "It'll smoke him out eventually," one said while levering his axe free from a stubborn knot. "Whole trunk like that, no proper airflow. Fire needs edges." Another nodded. "Too much wood at once. Either one. T burn right or it. I'll catch all at once and set his chimney ablaze." The judgments felt safe. They were built for an experience. Everyone knew how fire behaved when fed split logs. Everyone understood the rhythm of kindling, then medium splits, then larger pieces. It was a ladder of flame, predictable, contained within familiar boundaries. What he had done did not fit the ladder. He stepped outside only after the sun had climbed above the ridgeline, though its light carried no warmth. Snow creaked beneath his boots as he walked to the woodpile, not to chop, but to clear a narrow path to the cabin door. The wind had eased since nightfall, leaving the hollow wrapped in a deceptive stillness. Across the way, two neighbors paused their work to watch him. "Well," one called. "You still got a roof?" He gave a short nod. "Still got a fire, too." That answer drew a few low chuckles. "One tea last," someone muttered. He did not argue. Argument in winter wasted breath. Instead, he returned inside and let the door close firmly against the coal. The trunk had burned another inch or two while he'd been out. The exposed end was now a broad circle of blackened bark, framing a glowing core. The heat rolling from it was steady, almost heavy. Not sharp enough to drive him back, but constant enough to fill the room. He crouched and studied it again, as if examining a tool he intended to understand rather than simply use. The difference lay in surface. When a log is split, the inner fibers are exposed. Fresh faces drink oxygen greedily. Flame rushes along those planes, turning mass into heat quickly. Quick heat feels powerful. It also disappears quickly. That was the pattern every man in the hollow had accepted. Frequent feeding, frequent flare. A whole trunk, unbroken, did not offer so many invitations to the air. Its bark formed a barrier, imperfect but significant. Oxygen could only reach the exposed end within the hearth. The rest remained shielded. Fire, denied a wide front, was forced to advance slowly, chewing its way inward rather than racing along multiple faces at once. He had not read this in a book. He had watched it in smaller ways. He remembered once tossing a round, unsplit section of birch on coals in late spring. It had smoldered for hours, stubborn and dense, while the split pieces beside it vanished. At the time he had cursed it for refusing to catch properly. Now he reconsidered that memory as evidence rather than inconvenience. He took a small iron hook and nudged aside loose ash at the base of the trunk. Beneath it, a bed of consolidated coals pulsed with deep red light. Not scattered embers, but a single concentrated mass. That concentration mattered. When heat is focused, it sustains itself. He adjusted the damper again, only slightly. Too much air, and the exposed end would burn too fast. Too little, and it would choke, producing smoke. The balance was delicate but not mysterious. Fire always told you what it needed if you were patient enough to watch. Outside, speculation continued. He saving himself the splitting, that's what it is. One man said as he stacked fresh-cut pieces under his lean-to. "Calls it thinking. I call it lazy. Lazy Don T drag a whole tree into his house." Another replied, though without much conviction. The word stuck because it was easier than admitting curiosity. Inside, he made no move toward the axe leaning against the wall. That alone unsettled some of the others. An axe not in motion during deep winter seemed wrong, almost irresponsible. Labor equaled virtue. The rhythm of splitting logs was as much reassurance as necessity. It proved a man was doing something against the cold. He had chosen to do something before the cold instead. He remembered the first winter in this cabin, how he had followed the same pattern as everyone else. Split wood small for quick ignition. Keep the fire lively. Feed it often. He had prided himself on how bright his hearth looked. Visitors would remark on its vigor. Yet he had slept poorly that entire season. There was always the sense that the fire might fail if neglected. Always the small anxiety of listening for its crackle to fade. He had calculated roughly how much wood he burned in a week and been surprised at the volume. The pile diminished faster than expected. By late February, he had worried whether he had misjudged the season's length. This year, he had cut the same amount of timber, but instead of reducing all of it to uniform splits, he had left several trunks whole, trimming only branches and smaller protrusions. The others had laughed then too. "Can T stack those neat," they had said. He had not argued that neatness was not the same as efficiency. Now, as the morning wore on, the trunk continued its measured burn. Around midday, he noticed the bark along the unburned length had begun to warm slightly from the interior heat traveling through the wood. That internal conduction mattered as well. A massive piece of timber absorbed heat from the burning end and redistributed it slowly along its length. Instead of heat rising sharply and vanishing up the chimney, part of it remained stored within the trunk itself. Stored heat is quiet strength. He took a metal kettle, filled it with snow, and set it on a trivet near the glowing end. The snow melted gradually, steam rising in soft spirals. He did not need to heap extra splits beneath it. The steady radiance was enough. In another cabin, a man had to crouch repeatedly to coax his midday fire back to life after morning chores pulled him away. Split logs, left unattended, had burned down to ash faster than expected. He fed them again, irritated by the interruption. The difference was not yet dramatic enough to silence critics, but it was noticeable. Late in the afternoon, one of the neighbors knocked at his door, more from curiosity than concern. He opened it and let the man step inside. The visitor paused, surprised first by the warmth and then by the sight. The trunk extended from the hearth like the spine of some enormous creature, its far end still intact, its near end glowing with controlled intensity. "You ain't touched it since yesterday?" the visitor asked. "Moved it forward a bit this morning," he replied. The man stepped closer, careful not to get too near the heat. "Dawn, 'tid burn uneven. Split logs you can arrange. This," he gestured vaguely, "this just sits there." "It sits there and burns," he answered calmly. "That is the point." The visitor squatted, studying the charred circle. "Looks like it's eating from the inside." "It is. Only place air can get to it proper is right here." He tapped the exposed end lightly with the poker. "Less edge, less rush." The visitor frowned, trying to reconcile what he saw with what he had always done. "But Don, you lose heat not having a bigger blaze." He shook his head. "I lose less up the chimney. Big blaze means big draft. Big draft means heat goes straight out." The visitor stood slowly. He did not concede. But he did not laugh either. When he left, he carried with him not just the image of the glowing trunk, but the quiet realization that the cabin had not been filled with smoke, nor had it felt underheated. It had felt steady. That evening, as temperatures began to drop again, the hollow prepared for another long night. Axes rang out once more. Men split extra logs, determined not to be caught short after the previous night's demands. He did not join them. Instead, he examined the trunk. It had burned perhaps a foot since the previous afternoon. At this rate, it would last deep into the coming night without additional fuel. He considered adding a small split piece to increase the initial heat for the evening meal, but decided against it. The existing burn was sufficient. The second night would be the true test. Anyone could claim a fluke for one evening, but repetition proved intention. As darkness settled, the wind returned, though not as violently as before. Snow, already deep, reflected faint starlight in a cold shimmer. Inside cabins, fires flared anew as families gathered close. He adjusted his damper carefully once more, narrowing it slightly as the night deepened. Controlling oxygen was not about starving the flame, but about disciplining it. Too much air created greed. Too little suffocated. He thought of blacksmiths who controlled bellows to shape iron. Fire, like metal, responded to guidance. Hours passed. The trunk burned steadily inward, the circle of glowing wood expanding gradually but never exploding into chaotic flame. The bark along the sides blistered and cracked, but did not ignite along the full length. The fire remained localized to the hearth end. In other cabins, the cycle repeated: flare, fade, feed, flare again. Men rose from beds with practiced resignation. Some grumbled openly about the cold, about the endless appetite of split logs. "Should we cut thicker?" One muttered. "Thicker burns too slow to start," came the reply. They were right in a sense. Thicker pieces were harder to ignite when separated and stacked loosely. But what if thickness was not meant to be separated? Near midnight he woke briefly, not from cold, but from the habit that still lingered. He listened. The fire's sound had changed slightly. A deeper hum, a faint cracking as the inner core expanded under heat. He rose and inspected it. The burn had progressed cleanly. No excessive ash buildup. No choking smoke. He nudged the trunk forward perhaps half an inch and returned to bed. That was all. He did not fetch wood from outside. He did not split anything in the dark. Morning would show the others what repetition of the method looked like. But even before dawn, the idea had already begun to work its way into the hollow, as collective mind. Not as admiration yet, not even as acceptance, but as doubt. Doubt about whether the endless splitting of wood into ever smaller pieces was truly the mark of wisdom. Doubt about whether the brightest flame was always the best flame. And inside his cabin, as the massive trunk continued its slow, disciplined burn, the logic of the method revealed itself not in argument but in endurance. The third night arrived colder than the first two. By late afternoon, the sky had cleared to a hard, colorless blue that promised a deeper freeze once the sun slipped behind the ridge. Snow that had softened slightly under midday light now refroze into a brittle crust. Every step outside sounded like breaking pottery. Even the smoke rising from chimneys climbed straight upward for a time before flattening under an invisible ceiling of cold air. Men noticed it in their joints first. The ache sharpened, breath cut sharper in the lungs. The kind of cold settling over the hollow was the kind that punished small mistakes. Woodpiles stood shorter than they had at the start of the week, not dangerously so, but noticeably. Each night of frequent feeding had thinned them. Split logs vanished faster than memory suggested they should. There was always an intention to cut more tomorrow, and tomorrow always came with some other demand. In the cabin by the birches, the whole trunk had burned nearly 2 feet inward since it was first set in place. The unburned length still stretched well, beyond the hearth, thick and solid, bark dark and unbroken. The exposed end within the fireplace glowed with a depth that was no longer experimental. It was established. He studied it that afternoon with quiet satisfaction, though he did not allow satisfaction to turn into carelessness. The third night would be the hardest test yet. Cold without wind could draw heat straight through walls as if the boards were thin paper. Fires that felt adequate on breezier nights often struggled in still, crushing freezes. He cleared ash carefully from beneath the trunk, consolidating coals into a tight bed. He did not want suffocation by neglect. Efficiency required maintenance, not abandonment. The difference between laziness and design lay in attention. Outside axes rang steadily. Men split extra wood in anticipation. There was an edge to their movements, now less mocking, more determination. No one wanted to admit the experiment across the hollow had unsettled them, but none wished to risk being the one whose cabin cooled first either. As twilight deepened, frost began forming on the inside corners of windows. The cold had waked to it, pressing against structures. In one cabin, a door hinge squealed sharply as wood contracted. In another, a mother wrapped wool around the base of a drafty shutter. The fire in his hearth did not roar when he settled in for the evening meal. It radiated. He cooked over it without adding fresh splits, adjusting the kettle less distance from the glowing core. The heat was even enough that nothing scorched unless placed too close. The trunk's massive interior now acted like a slow-burning coal seam, releasing steady energy rather than flaring unpredictably. Across the hollow, flames leapt high in wide stone fireplaces as families front-loaded their fires for the night. Better to start hot and strong, they reasoned. Better to build a bed of deep coals early. The pattern had become ritual, feed heavily before bed, hope it lasts longer than the previous night. But split wood, no matter how generously stacked, carried its nature within it. Exposed edges drank oxygen eagerly. Heat surged upward in dramatic waves, but the surge always faded sooner than expected. By full dark the temperature plunged sharply. Frost crystals formed intricate patterns on window glass, delicate and deceptive. Outside, the hollow fell silent except for the occasional snap of contracting timber and the low hiss of snow shifting under its own weight. In his cabin, the trunk burned inward with deliberate patience. The glowing circle at its end had widened, the bark around it curling and blackening. A faint cracking sound came now and then as interior fibers surrendered to heat. It was not violent. It was steady. He lay down earlier than usual, not from exhaustion but from confidence. He left the damper slightly narrowed, careful not to starve the flame. The draft had proven reliable. The chimney drew cleanly even in still air. He listened once more for irregularities, no heavy smoke, no sudden roaring, just the low murmur of contained combustion. In a cabin nearer the creek, a man woke before midnight, sensing the room cooling. The fire he had built high at supper had burned hot for 2 hours, then collapsed inward faster than he'd expected. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and winced as his bare feet touched the cold floor. Coals remained, but they were scattered thin. He raked them together and added 2 split oak logs. They caught quickly, flames racing along their faces. For a moment the hearth blazed brightly again. He crawled back under blankets, hoping the new fuel would last longer. An hour later, he was up again. In another cabin, a chimney with a slight crack in its mortar allowed a faint draft shift. Each time the air pressure changed outside, the fire flared unpredictably. The man tending it had to rise 3 times in the night to prevent it from burning too aggressively and consuming wood at an even faster pace. Up the hollow, a young couple tried stretching their wood supply by adding smaller pieces more frequently rather than larger ones. The strategy backfired. The smaller splits burned even faster, leaving them with brief bursts of warmth followed by sharp cooling. The rhythm across the settlement became fragmented doors creaking open, boots thudding on floors, poker scraping against stone. In the cabin by the birches, the rhythm did not break. He woke once, around the hour, when the sky is deepest black and silence feels complete. Not from chill, but from habit and a faint change in the sound of the fire. He rose, pulled on his coat, and stepped to the hearth. The trunk had burned another several inches inward. The glowing circle now revealed a honeycomb of interior fibers collapsing gradually into coals. Beneath it lay a concentrated bed of ember-red heat. No frantic blaze, no dying ash. He placed his palm cautiously near the unburned section farther down the trunk. It was warm, not hot enough to burn, but holding stored heat from within. That warmth would radiate slowly back into the room even as the burning edge advanced. He nudged the trunk forward an inch, just enough to keep the glowing face positioned squarely within the hearth. The movement was controlled, gravity-assisted, and the flat stones beneath allowed it to slide smoothly without rolling. That was all he did. He did not carry in new wood. He did not split anything in the dock. He returned to bed and slept. Across the hollow, a man cursed softly as he discovered his carefully banked fire had burned down too far while he dozed. He struck flint to relight kindling, his breath fogging in the sudden chill of the room. His wife pulled blankets tighter around their children. Another neighbor, stubbornly determined to prove that thick split logs could last the night, had stacked 3 heavy pieces tightly together before sleeping. They burned hot and bright for several hours, but because of their exposed faces, they still surrendered more quickly than he'd hoped. By 3 in the morning he was up again, splitting another log in near darkness. The sound of axe against wood carried faintly through the frozen air. In contrast, the cabin by the birches remained quiet. The trunk's mass made a difference not just in burn rate but in stability. Because the fire advanced slowly, there were no dramatic collapses of structure inside the hearth. Split logs often shifted unexpectedly as their supporting edges burned away, sending sparks upward or requiring rearrangement. The whole trunk, however, retained its structural integrity along most of its length. Only the burning face changed, inch by inch. Toward dawn, the cold reached its lowest point. The sky outside turned a pale iron gray. Frost thickened on interior walls of some cabins where fires had weakened overnight. Water buckets in a few homes skimmed with ice. He woke naturally as light filtered through his small window. The cabin was warm enough that his breath did not show heavily in the air. He sat up and listened. The low murmur of combustion continued, unchanged in character from hours earlier. When he approached the hearth, he saw that the trunk had burned nearly halfway through its total length. The glowing circle at its end remained strong, coals bright and consolidated. Ash was present but not excessive. Heat radiated evenly. He stretched his hands toward it and felt no need to add fuel. Outside, morning activity began more sluggishly than usual. Men emerged from cabins with heavier eyes, shoulders tight from interrupted sleep. Wood piles had diminished further. One neighbor, rubbing his hands together for warmth, glanced toward the birches and paused. No chopping. No hurried movements. Just a steady thread of smoke rising calmly from the chimney. Curiosity outweighed pride. He crossed the frozen yard and knocked once. The door opened to a wave of steady warmth. He stepped inside and stared openly at the trunk, now shortened but still substantial. You did, T. Edmore. Did need to. All night? Moved it forward once. The visitor crouched close to the hearth, studying the glowing face. Still burning strong. It burns from one end. Takes its time. The man reached a cautious hand toward the unburned section farther back. Warm clear down here, he muttered. Heat travels through it, came the reply. Dust oil rush up the chimney. The visitor stood slowly, silent for several seconds. There was no mockery now, only calculation. By midday the story had shifted tone. No one openly admitted conversion, but fewer jokes were made. Instead, questions began forming. How thick was the trunk? What kind of wood? How do you keep it from smoking? Each question carried an unspoken admission. It had worked. That evening, as the cold continued its grip, a subtle change occurred across the hollow. One man selected a thicker, unsplit section from his pile and set it aside rather than reducing it immediately. Another left a larger round intact after trimming branches. They did not yet drag whole trunks inside, but the certainty that splitting was the only path had cracked. In the cabin by the birches, the long burn continued into its 12th hour and beyond. The trunk, consumed gradually from one end, had provided uninterrupted heat through the harshest cold of the week. It had required almost no midnight labor. It had proven that patience could outlast intensity. And as the sun climbed weakly into the frozen sky, illuminating shortened wood piles and tired faces, it became increasingly clear that the longest night had not belonged to the loudest flames. It had belonged to the slow, disciplined burn that no one had believed would last. By the 4th day, the cold no longer felt like weather. It felt like pressure. It pressed against doors and window frames. It crept through nail holes and hairline cracks in chinking. It settled into water buckets, stiffened leather straps, and made iron tools burn to the touch. The hollow had grown quieter in the mornings, not from peace but from fatigue. Interrupted sleep showed itself in slower movements, shorter tempers, and wood piles that seemed to shrink faster than expected. The trunk in his cabin had burned down to a little more than half its original length. The exposed end inside the hearth was no longer a neat circle. It had taken on a shallow bowl shape, where the hottest center had eaten inward more quickly than the edges. But the burn remained controlled. There had been no roaring flare, no smoke pouring back into the room, no frantic midnight feeding. It had burned through the harshest hours and kept burning. That morning when the sun rose pale and distant, he stood in front of the hearth and studied the progress. The glowing core pulsed steadily. Ash beneath it was light and dry, not thick and choking. He had moved the trunk forward only twice during the night, each time by no more than an inch. The adjustments were subtle enough that they barely counted as labor. Outside, the routine continued as it always had. Axes lifted and fell, wood cracked under steel, men hauled armloads inside, stamping snow from their boots before pushing through their doors. But the rhythm carried strain now. Each swing of the axe felt heavier after broken sleep. Each stack of splits represented not surplus but survival. By midday, a few of the men had stopped pretending the experiment meant nothing. One of them, a broad-shouldered farmer with hands rough from decades of work, stood at the edge of his woodpile and looked across the hollow toward the birches. He had heard no chopping from that direction since the whole trunk was dragged inside. Not once. He set his axe down and crossed the yard. The door opened before he knocked. "You still feeding that thing?" he asked, not bothering with preamble. "Only pushing it forward," came the reply. The visitor stepped inside and immediately felt the difference. Not an aggressive blast of heat that forced him back, but a steady warmth that wrapped around him evenly. He looked at the hearth and stared at the shortened trunk. "It's still the same one?" "The same." The man stepped closer. The glowing face inside the hearth radiated a deep, orange-red heat. The unburned portion stretched back along the floor, resting on flat stones, bark intact. No sign of the disaster they had predicted. No soot-blackened ceiling, no smoke stains. "How long since you lit it?" "Afternoon 3 days ago." The visitor did the math in his head and frowned. "You were telling me that one tree's been going near on 3 nights?" "It has been going near on 70 hours," he answered calmly. "Not blazing, burning." The distinction hung in the air. The visitor squatted, peering into the bowl-shaped burn. "It ain't he burning fast. That's the point." He reached for the poker and gently shifted a small mound of ash aside. Beneath it the coals were compact and alive, not scattered fragments but a single bed of concentrated heat. "You ever notice," he continued quietly, "how a big blaze throws most of its heat straight up? Chimney pulls hard. You feel hot standing close, but the room cools quick once it settles." The visitor nodded reluctantly. He had felt that cycle all week. "This does rush," he went on. "Less exposed wood, less edge for air to grab. It takes its time." The man stood and walked slowly around the trunk, studying it as though it were livestock he might consider buying. "And it don't smoke." "Not if you mind the draft." The visitor glanced toward the chimney throat. The damper was set neither wide open nor fully closed. Just enough air to sustain combustion without feeding it greedily. He left without saying much more. But the look on his face was no longer amused. That afternoon, the temperature dipped even lower than before. The sky cleared to an almost colorless white, and the air took on that brittle stillness that meant heat would not be returning any time soon. Snow on cabin roofs glittered faintly in the weak sun. Inside homes throughout the hollow, preparations began for what everyone sensed would be the coldest night yet. Men stacked extra split logs near their hearths. Women filled kettles and set them ready. Children were instructed to stay close to the fire and not stray near drafty walls. There was a tightening in the way people moved to quiet, understanding that the coming hours would demand attention. In the cabin by the birches, he examined what remained of the trunk. Perhaps 3 feet of unburned length remained beyond the hearth. Enough, he judged, to carry through another full night if managed properly. He did not add more wood. He did not split anything new. Instead, he scraped excess ash from beneath the burning end and ensured the trunk sat squarely aligned with the hearth opening. He adjusted the stones under it slightly so it would slide forward evenly as its weight shifted. Outside, a man paused mid-swing and watched him through a gap between cabins. No chopping, no frantic stacking, just small, precise adjustments. "Lazy," someone muttered out of habit, but the word had lost its certainty. Evening fell hard and fast. The sun dipped behind the ridge, and within minutes the temperature seemed to plummet another 10 degrees. Frost crept across window panes like a living thing. The hollow settled into tense quiet. In one cabin a fire was built high and bright in anticipation. Flames licked up the chimney, sparks snapping, It felt reassuring for the first hour. But as always, the exposed faces of split logs surrendered quickly to oxygen. By late evening, the blaze had already collapsed inward. In another home, a family experimented cautiously. Instead of splitting every piece small, the man placed a thick round into the hearth, alongside his usual splits. It smoldered stubbornly at first, refusing to catch evenly. He grew impatient and added smaller pieces to encourage it. The result was uneven, too much flame on the splits, not enough control on the round. It did not yet replicate the discipline burn across the hollow. In the cabin by the birches, the whole trunk continued its quiet work. As night deepened, the glowing bowl at its end grew wider but not wilder. The fire ate inward steadily, the bark curling away in blackened strips. The mass of wood beyond the hearth warmed internally, storing energy. The room held a constant temperature that did not swing sharply between too hot and too cold. He lay down without stacking fresh wood nearby. Midnight came and passed. The cold outside sharpened to its most severe edge of the season. Trees in the timber cracked loudly as sap froze and expanded. The sound echoed like distant gunshots across the hollow. In cabin after cabin, men rose from beds again. The cycle repeated: stir, feel the chill, swing legs down, rake coals, add splits. Sometimes the splits caught quickly. Sometimes they smoldered and smoked before flaring. Always the labor returned. A man near the creek rose 3 times before 3 in the morning. His woodpile indoors dwindled faster than he had planned. He stepped outside into the killing cold to fetch more. The snow beneath his boots screamed with each step. In contrast, the cabin by the birches remained dark and quiet except for the steady red glow in the hearth. He woke once, as he had the previous nights, and stepped toward the fire. The trunk had burned perhaps another 5 inches inward. The coals beneath were thick and powerful. He pushed the log forward slightly less than an inch and returned to bed. The adjustment took seconds. The night stretched long and bitter. Toward dawn, the hollow felt almost suspended in frost. No wind, no drifting snow, just an immense crushing cold pressing down. And then morning came. One by one, cabin doors opened. Men stepped out slowly, shoulders hunched. Their eyes carried the weight of broken sleep. Wood piles were thinner still. Some faces showed quiet worry. How many more nights like this could their supplies endure? From the cabin by the birches, a thread of smoke rose straight and calm. The broad-shouldered farmer returned, this time without pretense. When the door opened, he stepped inside and stopped short. The trunk shortened, but still present continued to burn. The room was warm. He walked to the hearth and stared at the glowing end. Still the same one, he said softly, not asking now. The same. He crouched and examined the coals. You telling me that thing burned straight through the night again? Yes. How many times you get up? Once. The man exhaled slowly, a plume of breath mixing with the warm air. I was up 4. He stood and looked around the cabin as if seeing it differently for the first time. There was no frantic pile of split logs near the hearth. No scattered ash from constant rearranging. No smell of heavy smoke. Just steady warmth. He reached out and placed his hand near the unburned portion of the trunk. Still warm down here, he murmured. Heat travels slow, came the reply, but it stays. The farmer nodded once, decisively. By midday, the story had spread beyond curiosity. It had become evidence. Another neighbor arrived, then another. They came not to mock, but to observe. They crouched by the hearth, studied the bowl-shaped burn, asked careful questions about draft and placement, and the stones beneath the trunk. One of them finally voiced what none had admitted aloud before. That ain't too lazy. He shook his head. It's less work. Less work, the man repeated as though testing the phrase. Outside, axes rang out again, but with a subtle change. A few men selected thicker sections of wood and set them aside rather than splitting them immediately. One dragged a heavy round toward his cabin door and paused, measuring its length against the width of his hearth. The idea had crossed from spectacle to strategy. As afternoon light faded once more, he looked at what remained of the trunk. Only 1.5 feet beyond the hearth now. It would likely burn through by the next morning. Nearly 4 full days from a single tree. He did not feel triumphant. He felt confirmed. When night fell again, he did not build a new fire. He simply let the old one continue its measured advance. Across the hollow, men experimented cautiously. Some tried thicker pieces. Some adjusted dampers more carefully than before. Some still clung to their familiar rhythm of splitting and feeding, unwilling yet to abandon it fully. But no one laughed anymore. And as the cold settled once more over the frozen hollow, and fires flared and faded in most cabins through the long hours, the cabin by the birches glowed steadily from within its whole tree, burning not with spectacle, but with endurance. By the time dawn returned, a final section of the trunk had nearly surrendered to ember-red coal. The 12-hour mark of uninterrupted overnight burn had been passed not once, but repeatedly. What had been mocked as laziness had proven itself as discipline. And in the brittle silence of that frozen morning, as tired men stepped into the snow and glanced toward the steady smoke rising beyond the birches, the lesson no longer needed argument. It radiated quietly, like heat from a single, unbroken tree. By the 5th day the cold had become ordinary, which was perhaps the most dangerous stage of all. When hardship first arrives, it sharpens awareness. When it lingers, people adapt not always wisely but persistently. The hollow had settled into its winter rhythm of split wood and broken sleep, though that rhythm had begun to feel less certain. In the cabin by the birches, the first whole trunk had finally burned down to a long, glowing spine of coals. What remained no longer resembled a tree so much as a trough of ember-red heat, dense and slow to fade. He had not replaced it immediately. He let the coals work, observing how long they would hold warmth on their own. They lasted longer than most men expected a fire to last without fresh fuel. That morning, when 2 neighbors stepped inside to look again, they found no active flame, just a broad bed of living coals radiating steady heat into the room. "You could light another log from that easy," one of them said. "Don't need to yet," he replied. The air inside was not hot. It was stable. That was the difference he had come to value more than brightness. The men stood quietly for a moment. Then one of them asked the question that had been forming for days. "Why does it last so long?" Not in accusation, not in disbelief. In curiosity. He crouched by the hearth and used the poker to expose the deeper glow beneath the ash. "Because it dawn't have much choice," he said calmly. They waited. "When you split wood," he continued, "you give the fire more edges, more faces. Air can reach all of them at once. It burns from many places at the same time." The broader man nodded slowly. He had always thought that was a strength. "It is," he admitted, "if you want fast heat." He drew a small line in the ash with the poker. But fast heat means fast wood gone. Fire eats where air can touch. The more surface you give it, the faster it eats. He picked up a short split log from a nearby stack and held it up. The clean, pale interior grain faced outward. All this fresh face air grabs it quick. Flame runs across it. He set it down and gestured toward the remains of the whole trunk. But this only burned where air could reach the end. The men looked again at the long, charred form. "Less surface," he said quietly. "Less rush." One of them frowned thoughtfully. "So it's not that it's burning hotter." "No, it's burning slower." The distinction settled between them. Heat is not only about intensity, it is about duration. That afternoon he dragged a second whole trunk inside. This time, no one laughed. The trunk was slightly thicker than the first, its bark rough and dark, trimmed clean of branches. He positioned it the same way, one end resting within the hearth, the remainder supported by flat stones so it would not roll or scorch the floor. He adjusted its angle carefully to align with the chimney as draw. The neighbors who watched did not mock. They observed. One of them even helped nudge it into place. Inside the hearth, the bed of coals from the first trunk still glowed faintly. He did not rebuild from scratch. He used what remained. He pushed the new trunk forward until its cut end met the waiting coals. Then he added only a small handful of kindling, not to create a blaze, but to encourage ignition at the center. Flame caught gradually, curling into the dense fibers. It did not flare dramatically. It began. The men remained a few minutes longer than necessary, watching the fire take hold in its slow, deliberate way. No explosion of sparks, no roaring draft. Just a steady, controlled glow forming at the heart of the wood. "It don't look like much," one said. "It don't need to," he replied. They left without further comment. That evening, as the second trunk established its burn, the hollow seemed subtly altered. A few cabins still relied entirely on split wood, their fires leaping brightly as before. But in 2 homes, thicker rounds had been placed into hearths alongside splits. In another, a man had resisted splitting one heavy section, and instead tried feeding it from one end. The results were uneven. Some smoked too heavily from poor draft. Some burned too fast because too much air was allowed in. Control required understanding, not imitation alone. In his cabin, the second trunk burned with the same discipline as the first. He adjusted the damper slightly narrower than usual, observing how the flame responded. When air was restricted too much, smoke thickened briefly and the glow dimmed. When opened too wide, the flame sharpened and threatened to consume too quickly. He settled in a middle position, enough oxygen to sustain steady combustion, not enough to encourage greed. Fire, he had come to understand, behaved much like appetite. Give it abundance, and it devours recklessly. Guide it carefully, and it sustains. That night, he did not wake until nearly dawn. When he rose and stepped to the hearth, The second trunk had burned inward only a few inches. The room remained evenly warm, no frost on the inside of the window, no stiff joints from cold floors. He stood for a long moment, studying the glowing face. Mass mattered. A split log might weigh 20 pounds and burn through in 2 hours of bright flame. A whole trunk weighing several times that would not burn proportionally faster. Combustion did not scale in a straight line. Surface area determined speed more than weight did. He did not speak of it in mathematical terms, but he understood it in practice. Later that morning, the broad-shouldered farmer returned with a question. "I tried it," he admitted. "With a whole trunk? With a thick round? Did T split it?" And, "Smoked bad at first. I had the damper wide open," he nodded. "Too much air'll make it angry." The farmer gave a short laugh. "That's about right. I shut it down some. Burned steadier after." "Did it last?" "Longer than my splits." The man looked toward the new trunk glowing in the hearth. "How you keep it from racing? Control the draft. Keep ash cleared. Let it feed from one end." The farmer folded his arms. "So it's not just about being thick. No. It's about how it meets the air." The lesson was not mystical, it was mechanical. That afternoon word spread that the second trunk had taken hold successfully. The mockery had disappeared entirely now. In its place stood quiet experimentation. One neighbor dragged a heavy, unsplit section of oak toward his hearth and positioned it similarly. He struggled at first with smoke until he narrowed his damper. The burn steadied. Another man, stubborn but observant, left a long length of hickory intact rather than cutting it into stove-sized pieces. He adjusted the length of his hearth slightly to accommodate it. Not all attempts succeeded immediately. Some chimneys drafted poorly. Some hearths were too shallow to support the method without rolling. But the idea had taken root. In the cabin by the birches, the second trunk continued its slow surrender to heat. He noticed another benefit now that he had time to observe carefully. The temperature inside the cabin did not swing dramatically between extremes. With split logs, the room often grew overly hot shortly after feeding, then cooled sharply as fuel diminished. That fluctuation strained both comfort and fuel supply. The whole trunk smoothed those peaks and valleys. Steady heat meant less expansion and contraction of walls, fewer drafts created by sudden temperature differences, and less stress on the chimney. He ran a hand along the interior wall one evening and noticed less frost forming near the seams than before. The consistent warmth prevented sudden drops that allowed moisture to freeze. It was not merely about saving wood, it was about stability. That night, as the second trunk entered its 10th hour of steady burn, he reflected on the word that had followed him since the first day: lazy. Lazy would have meant ignoring the fire and letting it choke in ash. Lazy would have meant failing to adjust the draft, failing to monitor smoke, failing to position the trunk carefully. This was not laziness. It was design. Across the hollow, fewer axes rang in the night. Men still rose from their beds, but less frequently. Some found that a thicker, slower burn required only one tending instead of 3. Some managed to sleep longer stretches for the first time that week. The cold had not lessened. The approach had changed. By dawn, the second trunk had burned inward only a modest amount. The glowing bowl at its end radiated deep warmth. He nudged it forward slightly, ensuring its face remained square to the coals. Outside, the hollow stirred more quietly than it had at the beginning of the week. Wood piles, though still reduced, did not seem to be vanishing at the same frantic pace. The experiment had not eliminated labor, but it had redirected it. Instead of endless splitting, there was more measuring, more thinking about draft, more attention to how a hearth was built and maintained. The broad-shouldered farmer paused that morning and looked across the hollow with something like respect. "It ain't tea about burning more," he said to another neighbor. "It is about burning right." The words carried. Inside the cabin by the birches, the second trunk continued its long, disciplined burn. Not spectacular, not dramatic, just enduring. And as the cold held firm over the frozen hollow, the lesson grew clearer with each steady hour. Heat was not only a matter of flame. It was a matter of control, of mass, of patience. And sometimes the thing that looked like the least work was simply the work done with the most thought. By the 6th morning, the hollow felt different. The cold had not broken. Snow still lay deep against cabin walls. The timber still cracked in the night. But something subtle had shifted in the soundscape of the settlement. The frantic rhythm of axes at dawn had softened. Not vanished entirely. Winter still demanded wood, but softened. From the cabin by the birches, smoke rose in a thin, steady column, neither thick nor hurried. Inside, the second whole trunk had burned nearly halfway through, its exposed end glowing with the same disciplined intensity as the first had days earlier. The method was no longer a single experiment. It was practice. He had not announced success. He had not gathered neighbors to explain it like a sermon. He had simply let it work. and work, when visible, speaks louder than defense. That morning, the broad-shouldered farmer did not come alone. Two others walked with him, boots crunching sharply over the frozen crust of snow. They did not knock loudly. They did not laugh. They waited until the door opened and stepped inside with quiet purpose. The warmth met them immediately, not a blast, not a suffocating wave, but a steady presence that felt dependable. The second trunk lay along the floor as before, its bark dark and intact beyond the hearth. The glowing bowl at its end pulsed steadily, coals dense beneath it. One of the men walked slowly around it, studying how it rested on the flat stones. "You keep it lifted," he observed. "So it don't scorch the floor," he replied, "and so it slides clean." The man crouched near the hearth. "How often you moving it?" "Once in the night. Sometimes not at all." A silence followed, not uncomfortable, calculating. The broad-shouldered farmer finally spoke. "I tried a full trunk yesterday." He nodded once. "How'd it go?" "Smoked it first. I had too much draft. Closed it some. Burned steadier after. And lasted the whole night." There it was. No boasting, no resistance. Just admission. Another neighbor shifted his weight and cleared his throat. "Reckon I misjudged it." "You weren't the only one," the farmer said with a faint grin. They did not apologize outright. Men rarely did for small matters, but they no longer called it lazy. That afternoon, the hollow saw a sight that would have seemed absurd only a week earlier: 3 separate cabins dragging whole trunks toward their doors. The movement was not dramatic. No speeches accompanied it. Just quiet effort, chains looped around bark, boots digging into packed snow. Where once axes would have been raised immediately to reduce those trunks into manageable splits, now they were guided intact toward hearths. Some cabins had to adjust their interiors slightly. A bench was moved. A table shifted a foot to one side. Flat stones were scavenged from near the creek to support the length of wood and prevent rolling. The idea was no longer his alone. Inside one cabin, a younger man wrestled his trunk into position and glanced toward the birches before closing his door. He had once laughed loudest at the sight of that first tree dragged inside. Now he measured the angle of his own hearth carefully, recalling what he had observed days earlier. Trial replaced ridicule. Not every attempt went smoothly. One chimney drafted poorly, sending smoke back into the room until the damper was adjusted properly. In another home, the trunk had been placed too close to the hearth wall, causing uneven burn until it was repositioned. Mistakes were made. Adjustments followed, but the hollow learned quickly. In the cabin by the birches, the second trunk continued its slow consumption. He noticed that fewer neighbors were waking repeatedly at night. Fewer bleary eyes greeted dawn. The axes that did ring in the mornings did so with more deliberation than desperation. The shift was not only in method, it was in mood. Winter felt less like a siege and more like something manageable. That evening, as temperatures dropped again, he stepped outside briefly to clear snow from around his door. Across the hollow he saw faint glows through cabin windows, steady glows, not wild flickers. He stood still for a moment, listening. No hurried chopping in the dark. No doors slamming repeatedly as men rushed to fetch more splits. The night carried a deeper quiet. Back inside, he checked the trunk and nudged it forward slightly. The glowing bowl at its end had deepened, coals thick and stable. The rest of the wood warmed gradually along its length, storing heat before surrendering it. He lay down without worry. In another cabin, the broad-shouldered farmer rose only once that night. He smiled faintly in the darkness when he realized how long he had slept uninterrupted. He stepped to his hearth, adjusted his trunk forward by a fraction, and returned to bed. Across the hollow, similar small movements occurred, brief, controlled, minimal. The longest night of the season passed with less strain than the previous ones. At dawn, frost still clung to windows. The cold still pressed against walls. But when doors opened and men stepped out into the snow, their faces carried less exhaustion. Woodpiles were still shrinking but not vanishing at alarming speed. One of the younger men walked across to the cabin by the birches that morning, not out of doubt but out of acknowledgement. "You were right," he said simply. He shook his head. "It ain't about right. It is about working." The younger man glanced back toward his own cabin, where a long trunk now extended from his hearth in imitation of what he had once mocked. "Looks like laziness from the outside," he admitted. "Most good ideas do," came the reply. They stood quietly for a moment, breath rising in the cold air. "It ain't that you were doing less." The younger man continued slowly. "It is that you were doing it once instead of over and over." He nodded. "Work smarter, not louder." The phrase hung between them. Word spread beyond the immediate hollow in the days that followed. A traveler passing through noticed the unusual sight of whole trunks resting in multiple hearths. He carried the story to the next settlement over the ridge. Some scoffed at first. Others listened carefully. Back in the hollow, the method refined itself through practice. Men learned to choose trunks of appropriate thickness, not so wide that ignition became difficult, not so thin that the benefit diminished. They learned to trim branches cleanly to prevent uneven burn. They learned to mind their dampers more carefully, recognizing that control of air was as important as control of wood. The change was not revolutionary in appearance. Cabins still stood where they had. Snow still drifted along their sides. Smoke still rose from chimneys. But inside, the rhythm had altered. Where once the night was punctuated by repeated awakenings and frantic feeding of flames, now it passed with measured adjustments and longer stretches of sleep. Where once woodpiles diminished in jagged bursts, now they declined steadily and predictably. And with predictability came calm. One evening, as the second trunk in his cabin neared its final third, several neighbors gathered inside, not formally, not ceremonially, just to sit in steady warmth and talk. The glowing bowl at the end of the trunk cast a deep amber light across their faces. "It's funny," the broad-shouldered farmer said thoughtfully. "We thought you were cutting corners." He smiled faintly. "I was cutting corners. Just not the way you meant." Laughter followed, not mocking now, but appreciative. Another man leaned forward. "Reckon we got used to thinking hard work always looks loud." "And looks the same," someone added. They watched the trunk burn quietly, no sparks flying wildly, no urgent crackling demanding attention. "In a way," the farmer said slowly, "it is less about the wood than about the thinking." He nodded once. Winter still had weeks left. Snow would fall again. Temperatures would rise and fall unpredictably. There would still be work to do, wood to cut, ash to clear, dampers to mind. But the hollow no longer feared the long night the way it had, because they had seen what steady heat could do. Days later, when the second trunk finally burned down into a long trough of glowing coals, he dragged a third inside, not alone this time. 2 neighbors helped guide it into place without being asked. There was no laughter, only quiet efficiency. The word lazy was never spoken again in that context. Instead, when a newcomer passing through remarked on the sight of a whole tree resting in a hearth, one of the men of the hollow replied calmly, "It ain't lazy. It is 12 hours of sleep." And as another bitter night settled over the frozen land, multiple cabins glowed not with frantic blaze, but with disciplined warmth, whole trunks, feeding their hearths from one steady end, burning long and slow without drama. Innovation had not arrived with thunder or proclamation. It had arrived quietly, like a deep coal holding heat, long after the brightest flame had faded. And in the steady red glow of those whole trees burning through the night, the hollow learned that sometimes the strongest fire is the one that refuses to hurry.